And welcome back. It's a great pleasure to welcome our last exhibitor of the online expo section, dear Aaron Sorensen. And today he will be presenting us his own speech. He is a partner at AXM Consultant Partners. It's a strategist who help clients grow and transform through a unique combination of artificial intelligence and behavioral science. Aaron leads the firm's business transformation and behavioral science teams. Over the course of his career, he has frequently led consulting engagements across hundreds of projects, focused on enabling leading organizations to overhaul and improve their approach to talent strategy, analytics, and organization design and team effectiveness. Dear Aaron, welcome on board. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. Hello to everyone at the forum from Chicago, Illinois.
Thanks, and I would like to welcome and give you a floor.
Excellent, thank you. I'm super excited here to present to the Global Collusion Online Forum today. What I'd like to share with you today for about 15 to 17 minutes or so is something that we're really excited about around demystifying inclusion using network science, and what we believe is a better way to measure and create real and sustained impact for diversity and equity outcomes. So the first thing I'd like to share with the group is about how we think about the relationships between employees and employers and how that has really changed over the last few decades. So if we go all the way back to the 70s and 90s, there was a bunch of research that focused on really creating work experiences that were more tolerable, driving productivity. If you think about the assembly lines, the focus then was engineering work to be more tolerable. In the 90s, there was some very seminal research done by Heskett and Schlesinger on the service profit chain that showed that if you have happy employees, satisfied employees, it will lead to satisfied customers and profit. So there was a focus on research in that era and organizations really following suit to drive profitability by ensuring their workforce was happy. Well, in the 2000s, that era was all focused on engagement. So the idea of more than just having a happy workforce, but really thinking about how to create drive, vigor, and ensuring employees knew what to do on the job was really important. You saw the rise of survey firms and engagement firms and engagement indices across the industry. In the 2010s, what we really saw was a shift to this idea about employee experiences and this idea of mass customization. So tailoring the employment value proposition and the experience to unique talent segments. If we think about the next decade and what we have ahead of us over the next 10 years, we believe by looking at the research and just looking at the current zeitgeist, it's all going to be focused on inclusion and well-being. And basically what that means is building deeper connections, right? Deeper meaning between employees and employers focused on psychological safety at work. Now, when we look at the events of last summer, particularly here in the United States, that really pushed and evolve the conversation into the C-suite. Our team looked at the earnings transcripts of about 2,000 publicly traded organizations and how they were talking about inclusion specifically over the last 5 years. And what you can see by this chart is that mentions of inclusion nearly doubled, and 40% of S&P 500 companies were discussing their DE&I efforts during the Q3 and Q4 earnings calls. What's interesting about what we saw in our research is that mid-summer 2020, a lot of the C-suite was unsure about how to respond to some of the incidents that were happening here in the United States with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. But then what you saw is this push from customers, shareholders, employees to take action. And you saw this dramatic effect. So again, this idea about well-being, inclusion is really sort of coming into the C-suite and it is a key focus now for organizations. When we look at some of the recent research, we see now that over 80% of organizations indicate that improving inclusion and workforce diversity as a top agenda item. What we also see is 39% of Fortune 500 companies have a diversity executive with the title of director or higher, and many organizations have a chief diversity inclusion officer that reports directly to the CEO. But what's interesting about this research is that less than 20% of the S&P 500 companies have DE&I metrics that are tied to their incentive plans. And that's really what matters. How are we driving that top level agenda? What we also know is that the industry of diversity, equity, inclusion training has grown significantly. McKinsey estimates that market to be about $8 billion. And what's frustrating, and one of the challenges that our team is wrestling with, is how is that investment really making a difference in terms of driving diversity and equity outcomes? One only needs to look to some of the challenges that have happened in Silicon Valley in terms of driving the diversity agenda to understand that the efforts that we're investing right now aren't paying off. So this was the challenge that we proposed to our behavioral science and our data science team. Why aren't we seeing meaningful and sustained change for diversity, equity, inclusion? And when we did the research and we came back and we said, okay, what are we seeing in the market? What are we seeing in the last decade of research? We really found four key things. The first thing is that language and definitions for diversity, equity, and inclusion activities are very loosely defined and tend to be imprecise, which leads to unclear goals and strategies around measurement, right? Even if you look at the academic literature, there is significant debate on how do you operationalize, how do you theorize, how do you conceptualize this idea of inclusion, let alone how do you measure it. We also found that DE&I strategies rarely get at the underlying organizational habits that undermine success, right? So if we think about organizations, they're complex in and of themselves, right? They have teams, you have organizations, you have structures, and most of the strategies rarely get at those interactions that happen between individuals and their superior, individuals and how they interact with teams, and looking across teams. So the sort of structural impediments and the habits of organizations really haven't been the focus of those strategies. We also know that the go-to DE&I solutions, and again, if you reference that $8 billion number that McKinsey has identified in terms of that industry, those go-to solutions in terms of employee resource groups and then training around unconscious bias rarely address the underlying psychological and structural impediments. So we know that ERGs, based on some of the research we've seen coming out of organizations like the Institute for Corporate Productivity, are viewed highly favorably, but there's no evidence to this day, some starting to emerge, that they really affect long-term outcomes. And we also know from some research out of Harvard, from a psychologist and sociologist, that unconscious bias training really only lasts a few days, and in some cases can have a negative effect on organizations. So part of the positives that came out of our research is that we identified that having a culture of inclusion, diversity, and equity cannot be sustained without inclusion, right? So inclusion is really the underlying and the underpinnings of having an organization that can sustain outcomes for diversity and inclusion, but it's difficult to measure and really hard to influence. So given this challenge, our team was set out to sort of crack the code. And another thing that we found was conventional approaches to measuring inclusion, mainly surveys, are often flawed, right? So if you think about how organizations are measuring inclusion today, they'll send out a survey and they are, one, invasive, two, incredibly biased in terms of sampling bias. When we're measuring inclusion, there's recency effects, thinking back to when was that time either where I was excluded or included. There's priming and loading biases. And really the key thing that our team identified is that to measure inclusion is a dynamic, complex, and multi-level psychological phenomenon. So to measure that, we need to understand how individuals are feeling included with their superiors, how individuals are feeling or experiencing inclusion on their teams, and how organizationally the organization is driving inclusion. So it's a multi-level phenomena that changes continuously and it's dynamic. And the nature of surveys is it just doesn't get at that. So that's what we sought out to address. And our mission is to bring behavioral science and data science to measuring inclusion in a way that's going to create sustained impact on the outcomes that we want to drive for diversity and equity. Now, how does this actually work? Well, our approach generates more sophisticated, valid, and actionable insights about inclusion using data from the tools that your teams use every day. So we all know, due to the COVID pandemic, that the digitization of the workforce has accelerated rapidly, right? What we do is we use existing enterprise data from tools like Microsoft Office 365. We tap into the Microsoft Data Connect API. We look at email communications. We look at who's participating in meetings. And we're not interested in the contents of those emails. We're not interested in the contents of the meeting. We are looking for the connections that are being made in organizations. We then combine that data with select HR data to understand who the individuals are. Sometimes we look at things like, is the individual a high potential employee? How long has the individual been at the organization? And then we apply network science in our artificial intelligence engine to model and understand where there are patterns of inclusion in the organization. And this allows us to design diversity, equity, inclusion strategies that are targeted in the areas that we believe in the data will drive the greatest impact. We pull all this together using our inclusion analytics platform that helps identify leaders and teams that foster and undermine inclusion. It also helps us pinpoint managers and leaders where intervention is required. And we can spot inclusion trends, which help us understand leading indicators of business and workforce metrics. But before I get into the measurement itself, one of the things that, again, as I mentioned, inclusion is so challenging to measure and is so poorly defined, our team really took an effort to try to define and operationalize inclusion and make sure that it's founded in solid theory and research. Our definition of inclusion includes two elements. First, psychological safety. So thinking about that as, are you able to sort of bring your full self to work without fear of retribution or punishment in terms of sharing your ideas and your perspectives? Second is about belonging. Do you have that connectedness or that sense of community in the organization? And then the next thing is this multi-level connectedness, right? I mentioned earlier that diversity, or inclusion rather, is a multi-level phenomenon. It is not enough for an organization just to have one inclusive team. It is not enough for an organization or an individual to have an inclusive relationship with his or her superior. For inclusion to manifest culturally as an organization, there needs to be inclusion felt by individuals, inclusion based on specific relationships, usually subordinate supervisor relationships, patterns of inclusions across teams, as well as the organization. What we can do with our analytics is assess inclusion across the organization and identify hotspots. So specifically, we can determine what are the norms of inclusion for the organization. How is inclusion experienced by underrepresented groups? And where are there silos emerging in the organization related to either exclusion or inclusion? Through our analytics platform, we can identify two key metrics that we look at. The first is a diversity index, which is a ratio-based metric based on gender, age, and ethnicity that we combine and aggregate. And the other is our inclusion index. And this is the one that we're really proud about. Our inclusion index is entirely made up of network science. And you can see the 9 metrics there on the right. So specifically, age inclusivity, the degree to which individuals are interacting with people of their same age groups or different age groups. Racial, ethnic inclusivity. Gender inclusivity, accessibility, which means how easy is it to access people in the network? Balance, how well is social capital shared across the organization? Community strength, connectedness, and the strength of those relationships. And tribalism, or the degree to which you start to see clustered networks across the organization. Through these 9 metrics and the aggregation of those, what we can begin to do, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, is start pinpointing and hotspotting where inclusion is occurring or not occurring in the organization, and how well we're doing against our diversity targets. So often our clients are asking questions like, how diverse are we and how inclusive are we? What we can do is identify those teams that are bucking the trend or those teams that are having challenges and create targeted interventions to address those. We can also bring awareness and actionable focus to teams with dysfunctional norms. So specifically, we can understand how inclusive teams are, whether inclusivity breaks down across teams, and how long it takes to become an inclusive team. What you see here is an example of looking at team inclusivity by gender, where team A has low gender inclusivity and team B has high gender inclusivity. Through our analytics platform, we can actually compare those teams, looking at those 9 inclusive metrics and try to understand what is the underlying experiences of the individuals on those teams, and at a team level, how can we begin to diagnose what's happening? So in this particular example, we see team 106 that's been disguised, where there's 40 employees across 5 offices and 2 service lines. And for these 2 teams, you can see that overall, they have a fairly high degree of inclusivity as measured by our inclusive metrics at 63. And it's really being driven through accessibility and balance. But you can see their community strength and connectedness is a little bit low, and is likely the reason why we see the separation of these 2 entities. And again, this just shows that dynamic phenomena of looking at the network science and understanding how teams are evolving. We can also identify who's being marginalized in order to probe and act. So specifically, we can understand from a team leader and team member standpoint, how inclusive are the relationships between managers and leaders? Remember, we can measure now through data engineering and accessing these metadata in the tools that you use every day, how often are team members spending time with their direct superior or their supervisor that is not their direct report. That really helps us understand access and whether individuals from underrepresented groups have those same relationships. And in this case, you can see individual A with a lower inclusion score. We can also proactively identify individuals who are experiencing less inclusion and recommend targeted interventions before they disengage. So we can tell if individuals are experiencing different levels of inclusion and whether this varies by tenure in the organization, age, gender, and ethnicity. Where in this case, you see in this network graph, individual A is experiencing high inclusion, while individual B is experiencing relatively low inclusion. Now, for organizations where they're interested in driving actionability down to the individual level, and I will say, not every organization wants to know individual level inclusion metrics. Some organizations say, hey, you know what, I want to understand where the teams are driving inclusion or not, and that's going to be my point of intervention. Some organizations want to go to this team level and really sort of drive those tactics. What we can do with the analytics platform is understand how are specific individuals experiencing inclusion. We can look at females, and again, this is referencing that team 106 that we just looked at. How are females experiencing inclusion? What's the distribution of that inclusion? How are males experiencing it? And how is our majority or our non-majority group experiencing inclusion by looking across these various network metrics? So with these analytics and this approach, we believe, and what we've seen in our clients, is you can really understand inclusivity and address the underlying challenges and problems that most organizations are having. So we can answer questions like, how inclusive is your organization? No kidding, really, not based on biased invasive surveys, but based on the data. We can understand where tribalism is emerging and holding back efforts to be inclusive. We can understand where there's challenges from underrepresented groups in terms of getting access to leaders and influencers that are going to help them grow their career. We can understand what organizational dynamics are challenging people to integrate in the culture and the degree to which inclusion is being fostered or undermined in those particular organizations. Another thing that we can do is determine who the key influencers are in the organization. So if you're looking to affect change, the quickest way to do that is to identify where the social capital exists in the organization or key influencers and equip them to be able to drive change. One of the key things that we're seeing our clients do. And then finally, one of the questions that we can help answer is, how mobile is talent from underrepresented groups? And how do we ensure that they're making the right connections to grow, flourish, and foster in the organization? So again, we're super excited about what we're able to do with our network science and behavioral science to really drive inclusion. And my question for this group is, will you crack the code when it comes to inclusion? Thank you for your time today, and I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'll open it up for questions.